September 18, 1992. I was 33 years old, and at 2:47 a.m., a call came through that I still remember as if it were a sound echoing down a long concrete corridor. I say this plainly because someone has to say it plainly. In the small hours of that night, I confronted a being that did not belong to the taxonomy of our textbooks. And I sat across from it in a fluorescent room, and it told me more about ourselves than any interrogation I had ever led. I wear the badge of the Bureau because I earned it in the way men earn many things, the hard way, with paperwork and hours behind observation windows and nights manning phones. And that is the exact credential that put me in that sealed room when everything else could have been left to the laboratories or to the men in uniform. I had been an agent in the Behavioral Sciences Unit at the FBI for 9 years then, and I knew how to read a face and how to ask a question in a way that made someone answer. I had been eating takeout in a rented apartment, my TV on and my hands stained with sauce, when my pager blinked a number that, given the time and the tone of the message, could only mean one thing: a problem with national sensitivity. I remember thinking that it would be a routine transfer or a request for an affidavit. Instead, the dispatcher said 2 words that froze the heat in my palms: Bigfoot containment. I kept that file sealed for decades, not out of cowardice, but because the information inside sat at the hinge of ethics and power. I am telling it now because secrets that could change the law of nations should not be buried with a single man dying of ordinary human things. My name is Daniel Cross. On that night, I was called to a compound run by the Department of Defense and marked for classification. Follow me if you want to see what happened in the bright rooms behind those gates and why it matters to all of us. I had worked with universities and observatories, I had testified in federal court and briefed committees on Capitol Hill. And that combination of field experience and institutional access is what made me credible when I walked through the checkpoint into the compound. They gave me a security clearance, and they gave me a ledger of instructions that read like a manual of containment and omission. The unit that pulled me in was a joint task force with the DoD and a small DARPA advisory panel. Dr. Elias Kim from the university lab met me at the hangar, and his hands were stained with iodine. Colonel Robert Hale of the Army Operations Center wore a suit and a look that said he had not eaten for 24 hours and believed prayer was a logistics problem. Agent Marcus Ruiz from our counterintelligence unit rode shotgun in the convoy, and Sarah Monroe, the legal counsel, sat silent with a notepad that shook a little when she tried to write. The route to the enclave was 2 hours of black road and red highway reflectors, a chopper pad, then a gate that gave us authorization codes and sequences that must still be logged in a now encrypted archive. We arrived at 5:03 a.m. The weather was thin and wet and smelled like old leaves and diesel. The compound looked like a cross between a university observatory and a makeshift reserve for specimens. Cameras focused on perimeter trees. Motion sensors were warm to the touch when I pressed my palm to a post. The initial briefing was curt and full of words that are meant to reassure classification, retention, biosample, chain of custody. I was shown photographs first. The first photograph was a night vision shot of a silhouette the size made for a myth, and the face that looked back had the weary intelligence of a creature tired of hiding. I expected outrage or laughter from the suits, but what I found was something nearer to confusion and an ethical knot. The sight of that photo made my stomach roll like I had the flu and made the fluorescent lights seem too bright and clinical and cruel. They took me into a secure room, and there were briefings that read like a debate between 2 governments within one building. Dr. Priya Desai argued for a measured scientific approach. She wanted culture-swabbed, microbiome sequencing, non-invasive neuroimaging, and a covenant of observation before any invasive technique. Colonel Hale argued that any unknown species represented a potential threat and that the department could not risk spillover events or the possibility that the creature could be weaponized or that its presence would cause panic. Professor Helen Carter of the Anthropology Department pointed out precedents where classification followed politics and concluded that ethics must guide us, or we would be lawless in the name of security. Mayor Luis Ortega had been called in as a local liaison, though he had no clearance to know what he was being asked to deliver to his constituents. At the heart of our debate were three options: keep it isolated for autopsy under military supervision, attempt a peaceful communication in sanctuary, or move it to a denser facility for study with limited disclosure. The clock on the wall blinked toward midnight as political aides called in and demanded decisions. Sarah Monroe read a memorandum aloud, offering legal terms: a temporary immunity for certain actions if the federal government placed the matter under a special executive order that supplied funding and veto power to the DoD. We had an initial 24-hour protocol attached to it. The memo used the words classification and retention like liturgy and ended with a demand that a decision be made within 72 hours. The stakes were not only life and death, but reputation, jurisdiction, and the future of any treaty that might govern contact with non-human intelligence. When they opened the door to the interrogation room, I remembered the first sensory impressions. A room that smelled like antiseptic and cedar smoke, a humming fluorescent panel overhead, the tactile cling of vinyl on my palms, a distant metallic echo from the corridor, and the subtle sweetness of the papers we carried. The room had a window, but what I remember most is the sound of breath, heavy and thoughtful, from the being on the other side. It was not a captive in the sense of a criminal. It sat upright, like a person, like a matriarch older than her clan and tired beyond telling. The lights turned to a warmer tone when the technicians adjusted them, and the creature shivered like a patient adjusting to a bath. Dr. Kim introduced the protocols we would use: micro cameras, a set of vocabulary cards, and an interface that registered pitch and rhythm. I was told to ask one question and let the response lead. I sat and I asked for its name. For a long minute there was a silence full of small sounds: the rustle of too many coats, the click of a recorder, the soft coughing of Colonel Hale, the scraping of a chair leg, the distant thump of generators. Then, in a voice that required no throat, it said its name. The moment it pronounced that first sound became the anger of everything. It said, as if through a small bell that hung in a cave, the syllable Loma. The crew in the observation room laughed nervously at the unexpected lyricism of it, and Agent Ruiz mouthed a curse that would be blacked out in any report. Loma repeated the name and then attached a gesture, like a human would close her hand to her chest, then open it, palm up, like an offering. I asked if that was a name or a description. Loma tilted its head and tapped a card that had both a photograph and a scrawl of letters. I counted the exchanges while muting the recorder in my mind, because I needed to keep their cadence like a metronome. There were small back and forths, a dozen of them, easy, while we tested whether the being understood the idea of law, concept, reciprocity, personhood. "Are you hurt?" I asked. "We hurt," it answered. "Do you wish to leave?" said Dr. Desai, in a voice that was thin with hope. "We bound," Loma said, and made a motion like a line of people linking arms. The first contact was not a puzzle, it was an arrival into shared moral language. Within 14 explicit exchanges, we had established that Loma belonged to a group that called itself a clan, that they had a matriarch, that their settlement was to the north, and that they had been losing numbers. We had proved personhood in the messy human way. Names and reciprocal gestures. The agreement to attempt communication rather than autopsy was born in that small room, and it felt to me like the choice between two kinds of history. We could treat them as data or as others. This was the moment that forced me to choose. What Loma told us about their history came not in a single monologue, but as a stitched narrative across several sessions where we learned to listen beyond words. Their story of place began centuries before our maps of forest and mountain had been drawn. They spoke of seasons with changes in bark, of winters that held a blue light in the snow, of a river that carved their calendars, and of a migration that once saved them from a plague of beetles. They numbered their dead in kin groups, and they counted their living in the low hundreds. "We were many," Loma said at one point, and tapped a faded photograph we later learned was a pictograph. "Now we are few," it added, and the room smelled then of old wood and the metallic tang of fear. Over the course of hours that stretched into nights, they revealed a pattern of contraction, a settlement abandoned to encroachment, a clan displaced by logging, and then by a disease that we would later identify as a zoonotic crossover from domestic livestock. They used words that translated into English as treaty and reserve, but with meanings rooted in responsibility, not property. They had rituals to mark the authorization of an elder, and a system of surveillance that relied on smell and sound, and an observatory of sorts, a high ridge where watchers would signal with light and song when strangers came near. I recorded this in careful notes, and Professor Carter cross-referenced their artifacts with known primate tool use and with early human settlements. The backstory of the protagonist, the being called Loma, was braided with my own past. I grew up in a small timber town where my father worked on the line, and I learned early the bitter arithmetic of resource extraction. My backstory is not incidental to the conflict I would face. I had seen towns torn by promises of jobs and left barren by contracts that did not include families. I had watched a childhood friend die because the company had failed to install proper drainage and his lungs filled with dust. That background sat in my chest like a weight when I listened to Loma describe whole groves cut down and water changed by chemicals. My history of small-town loss made me predisposed to understand and protect rather than to classify and dissect. The three-paragraph backstory of my childhood, my father's injury, and my choice to join the Bureau in search of accountability is the chain that links my choices that night to the moral stance I would take. That personal history was 5 lines, the kind you file away until a crisis calls it back, like a ledger closing a debt. It colored every negotiation I conducted. The scientific team represented by Dr. Kim and Dr. Desai wanted to document everything. They proposed a step-by-step sampling sequence, swabs first, then blood draws using microlancets, then non-invasive imaging with portable fMRI units if authorization could be granted within 88 hours. The description of procedures stressed chain of custody and contamination control. All samples would be logged with 2 forms of identification, photographed under spectral light and sealed in 3 layers. A transport team would be cleared through the compound in a window of 4 hours, and any storage would require a BSL-4 rated containment with a sentinel that checked temperatures every 15 minutes. Legal retention of materials required an authorization code and access logs. These procedural details read like a hymn to bureaucracy, and in their cadence I heard the possibility of either protection or exploitation. The military view favored containment and rapid autopsy to preempt any risk. Their protocol was described in crisp procedural sentences and included a 96-hour purge window, a controlled burn of certain materials, and a standing order that any biological agent would be cataloged and then appropriated for defense research. That paragraph of protocol that I read aloud in the briefing room contained 312 characters of hard language about custody chain frequencies and authorization levels, and it was the moment where my stomach clenched. As the clock moved toward the 72-hour deadline, the pressure increased. The chain of command sent a representative, a man named William Harrow from the Defense Department, who carried a legal brief and a quiet voice that trained people to do the ugly arithmetic of casualties. He argued that the public risk of disclosure outweighed the moral imperative of sanctuary and suggested a deal, immunities for certain actions in exchange for exclusive research rights. "We will sterilize all evidence where necessary," he said. "We will grant funding and a framework for ongoing surveillance," he added. The choice was tightened by a midnight deadline set by an unnamed senator who wanted to control the narrative before news outlets could pick up a rumor. The political aides attached to our task force leaked phrases designed to panic the local government: land rights interference, native claims, job contracts. There was a point where Sarah Monroe read from a memo that if we did not act to secure the specimen, the Defense Department would invoke emergency powers and the Bureau would be left to cover the political fallout. The pressure from the DoD and the suits had the weight of a closing trap, and it was in this moment of institutional compression that negotiation turned into a moral test. We decided to travel to the settlement. The movement there was cinematic in a way that horror films never are: quiet and ordinary and brutal. We boarded a helicopter at dawn, the rotor chopping the cold air into snow pieces and the smell of fuel mixing with the wet pines. Colonel Hale sat with a rifle, his fingers methodical on the metal and his jaw set. Agent Ruiz reviewed a map with bright markers and a GPS that hummed. I strapped myself in and lowered my head because images were too sharp to hold. We approached the valley in the softest of lights when fog lay like a blanket over a sleeping town. From above, the settlement looked like a bruise, a nodule of human absence among a grid of tree lines. We landed in a clearing where the grass was flattened in long arcs and where someone had burned a shallow fire not long before we arrived. There was a sound like a flute at the edge of hearing, a tune that signaled watchfulness and hunger. We moved in silence as if sound could break a promise. The scene in the clearing became the crucible. There were people there, not human people, but the clan of Loma. They approached us slowly and measured. The communication was mostly through gaze and ritual motions. At one point, Loma walked into the center of the clearing and raised her hands in a sequence that meant peace. Colonel Hale whispered an order that was not meant to be obeyed. He was about to give a point that would have led to a volley and to bloodshed when I stepped between the barrel of a rifle and the matriarch. The gesture was instinctive, and it was the fulcrum between two outcomes. The confrontation produced 3 moments of sharp tension. The first, when Hale shifted his weight and the muzzle rose. The second, when a child of the clan screamed and the entire group contracted like a living thing. And the third, when Loma laid her palm on my chest as if to test the warmth of my heart. Each of those moments lasted in my memory like a small novella. The first moment, I felt the metal of the rifle barrel pierce the skin of my argument that violence solves threats. I heard the soft click of a safety release and the whisper of boots on pine needles. The air smelled of gun oil and wet earth, and the soundscape had a high tone like a jar of glass being rubbed. The second moment, when the child screamed, was a shriek that contained all our fears and made the night animal. The child was small, and its voice cracked like an instrument out of tune. People behind me took in breaths like bellows. The third moment, when Loma placed her hand on me, was a sensation of animal fur and human pulse. The roughness of a palm calloused by branches, and the fragility of someone trusting you with their life. I heard the rustle of fabric and a breath that was a confession. Dialogue in that clearing stretched long and needed to be thick with exchange to carry us through the decision. There were 12 discrete turns between me and Colonel Hale, between me and Loma, and between me and Dr. Desai. "Lower the weapon," I said. "You cannot pick us as a target," Hale answered. "They speak," I replied. "They speak, and remember," Dr. Desai said softly. "Orders," Hale countered. "Orders are made by people who sometimes decide to be immoral," I said. "Do you accept a treaty?" Loma asked in a voice made of old trees. "We have nothing to offer that our people will not lose," I said. "Then protect," Loma intoned, and looked at me like a judge would. "Who will sign?" Colonel Hale asked. "I will," I said. "Will the Bureau vouch?" Michael Hargrove, a lawyer in our team and a name I had not yet mentioned, said from the edge. And then Sarah Monroe read aloud clauses while Dr. Priya Desai explained the scientific terms. And Professor Carter sketched a model of a reserve with boundaries and funding lines. We bartered not in money, but in guarantees, surveillance mechanisms, and controlled research windows. The bargains felt inadequate. In the end, the decision hinged on an offer of sanctuary, a legal instrument of reserve status that would create a protected enclave and a treaty-like status with oversight by a panel including scientists, ethicists, and one representative from the clan, their matriarch. The negotiations produced a paper, a detailed protocol that read like new law. It required a trilateral council composed of a bureau liaison, a DoD observer, and an independent academic, a rotating chair. It demanded a specific chain of custody for any biosample and required 3 signatories. It called for a moratorium on autopsy and a schedule for non-invasive study. It limited the use of any data to conservation and mutual health, and it demanded an authorization code signed at federal level for any escalation. The protocol included a clause for immediate sanctuary when the settlement faced certain defined threats and outlined a dispute mechanism for any violation. The legal text was an attempt to translate the ethic into enforceable measures, and when I read it aloud in the final meeting, I felt both the relief of a man who had negotiated and the terror of a man who knew how easily ink can be ignored. We returned with the clan's consent to mark a reserve. The DoD kept a monitoring post at a respectful distance, and DARPA funded a non-invasive observational observatory built on a ridge. The settlement was mapped and a demographic count produced. They numbered 312 individuals across several related clans. But the crucial number, the one that made the math of survival tender, was the reproductive rate, a measure that showed a steady decline. The risk of extinction was real. We set up a slow program to repair habitat corridors and to negotiate logging moratoria with local companies and with the municipal government, where Mayor Luis Ortega brokered a local clause tying jobs to a preservation fund. The whole effort required surveillance cameras disguised as rocks and scent lures replaced with ethical monitoring devices. The vocabulary of the entire operation had to change from capture and autopsy to reserve treaty and protection. At roughly 1/3 into our record of those events, when I had told you about the first images and the first exchanges, you might be feeling the same mixture of wonder and unease that I felt then. If you are feeling the same shock that I felt in that narrow fluorescent room, know that you are not alone. What would you do if you were in my place? Write protect if you think we should listen and shelter them, or write study if you think science must have priority. I will read every answer and use this consensus to decide what interviews and documents to release next. Your opinion matters to the way we will frame this for policymakers, and it matters to how we will ask other witnesses to come forward. Now I must tell you what happened next because the consequences of our choice became national. The media never learned the whole story. There were leaks and spins, and the Department of Defense issued statements that contained careful omissions. A narrative formed that framed the event as a security incident of limited scope. Several scholars wrote cautious papers about primate intelligence, and a few pundits argued we had been foolish to play savior. Internally, we established a surveillance and research committee that included Professor Helen Carter, Dr. Elias Kim, Dr. Priya Desai, Michael Hargrove, and a rotating bureau unit. We developed a reserve plan that required recurring funding and the creation of a treaty-like document signed by local officials, the Bureau, and a representative of the clan who would be given sanctuary status and the right to appoint an advocate. In practice, that meant a system of checks and balances, an observatory on the ridge, and a small controlled research unit without autopsy permission unless certain biologically defined thresholds were crossed. The technical description of that governance is precise and procedural, involving timelines for review every 90 days, logs of all observational data stored in a cross-jurisdictional server with dual encryption keys, and third-party audits. The protocol required physical separation of any biosample with triple containment and required disposal procedures specified to the gram and to temperature ranges, which made the whole thing seem bureaucratic and human at the same time. There were several forks in the path where things could have gone worse. Moment 1, a militia group that called themselves hunters trespassed into a buffer zone and shot a hound that belonged to the clan. That night, tension boiled into a siege. Moment 2, A junior officer at the observatory disobeyed orders and collected an unsanctioned tissue sample which he sealed and later attempted to sell. That betrayal nearly collapsed the trust we had stitched. Moment 3. A senator used a photo. Each of these moments demanded immediate tactical response, legal measures, and morally risky calls. The militia incident required negotiation with local law enforcement and a show of restraint, a precise escalation where I personally brokered a safe exchange and a public statement that framed the event as a misunderstanding. The unsanctioned sample required a legal procedure we had rehearsed, a chain of custody audit, criminal referral, and the imposition of a gag order. The senator's hearing was diffused by a crafted privacy clause and an agreement to brief the committee in closed session with redacted evidence. Each crisis was handled through a mix of legal muscle and human diplomacy, and each time the vocabulary of reserve and treaty kept us from sliding into extermination. The weeks that followed saw small victories and larger anxieties. We built a passive monitoring observatory and installed cameras that could read temperature signatures. We set up a network of oral histories with the clan so that their narrative would be part of our record. Dr. Kim led a microbiology study that used non-invasive swabs and environmental DNA to understand disease vectors and to identify the crossover that had devastated previous generations. Dr. Desai designed a cultural interface that relied on music and scent to communicate basic needs and signals. Professor Carter organized community meetings in town halls to tie the preservation fund to local jobs and to quell fear. Chief Anita Crow, a tribal liaison from a neighboring indigenous government, offered an expertise on treaty making and introduced us to cultural precedents that made our legal documents more responsive. We involved Mayor Luis Ortega to buy local buy-in, and we kept Michael Hargrove on the legal team to ensure the process had teeth. Those names are not mere ornament. They represent actions and obligations that shaped the outcome. 6 months after the clearing, the reserve was formally recognized in a limited way. The DoD maintained a monitoring presence, but with stricter oversight. Our unit had achieved an uneasy peace, but I could not forget the face of Loma, the compassion there, and the quiet accusation that we had to choose. The community reaction was mixed. Some saw protection as an intrusion on resource development. Others supported the jobs that the Conservation Fund promised. The media turned the story into a mystery series, and the public mostly rewrote our careful legal language into sensational headlines. Internally, we kept records, we redacted, and we filed them under classification. The Bureau established a permanent liaison role and named it the Conservation Ethics Officer to bridge between investigation and protection. That move institutionalized the lesson we had been forced to learn that night. The epilogue comes in 3 beats, in 1 month, 3 months, and 6 months, each revealing consequences we could not have predicted. 1 month later, a small documentary crew arrived with the consent of the clan. Council and filmed a short piece on the reserve. The film humanized the clan and showed scenes of Loma teaching young ones to weave a trap from bark. The footage was compelling and warmed public hearts. The local logging company renegotiated a smaller contract and agreed to fund a worker retraining program. The reserve protocol required immediate inspections, and we found that initial contamination risks had been mitigated. The first month read like a success, measured in repairs and community outreach. Yet even then, the threat of ideological groups remained. 3 months later, the demographic study showed a slight uptick in birth rates among the clan. The initiatives to restore corridors had begun to show effect, and Dr. Kim reported that pathogen loads had decreased by 14%. The legal mechanisms we drafted had been used as a defense in a federal hearing, and the judge had upheld the classification of certain data in the interest of public safety. That judicial backing bought time, but also brought scrutiny. 6 months on, the model we had created became a tentative template, a pilot program eyed by other agencies. We had a symposium where representatives from the Bureau, DoD, DARPA, universities, and tribal authorities presented a framework for protection and research aimed at preventing future tragedies. The reserve was not safe yet, but the settlement had a roof over certain rights and a slow plan that might save its people. In these three temporal moments, there was progress and complication, and the work to secure the clan became the work of an ad hoc community of professionals and citizens. There are consequences that follow up on a personal level for me and for others. I changed careers in small increments. I left active duty in the field and moved into policy because the work demanded someone who could navigate both empathy and legal code. Some colleagues left resentful of the constraints the ethics required. Others stayed and found work that matched their conscience. Agent Marcus Ruiz took a position in field liaison. Michael Hargrove remained as counsel, and Dr. Priya Desai took a fellowship to study cross-species ethics. Dr. Elias Kim later testified in a closed session, and Professor Helen Carter wrote a paper on the measure of a people that cited our case as a turning point. Chief Anita Crow worked with us to draft a regional treaty that might be a model for other cases. These personal threads are part of the wider weave. The institution changed too. The Bureau added a policy unit to oversee non-human contact that must at least be auditable. And the DoD agreed to new limits on biological appropriation, though those agreements came bound with many loopholes. When I look back at that clearing, when I imagine the palm of Loma against my chest, I think about the phrase that kept returning to us. The measure of a people is in what it chooses to protect. It is easy to say that the world is full of things to be feared, but fear is often the cloak nations use to bargain for power. We chose to protect. We could have chosen to weaponize and classify, and in doing so, perhaps saved one set of human anxieties while destroying another living culture. The choice we made sits like a scar and a promise. It taught me that legal language without ethics is a tool for erasure, and that ethics without legal teeth can be sentiment without effect. The work of protection is ugly and bureaucratic and mundane, and it requires patience and documents and signatures and surveillance and enforcement and the logistics to translate compassion into policy. There are still questions that haunt me now. How many other settlements exist out there in shadows of our maps? How many species suffer decline because our economies value timber and metal over breathing and song? What legal instruments will survive a change in administration or a hungry market? These are not rhetorical, they are practical, and they require institutional commitments that outlive any one man. If the story of Loma teaches anything, it is that the world is not only bigger than we imagine it, but morally more complex than our policies are designed to be. The trade-offs between surveillance and sanctuary, between study and respect, will define us. If you want to follow this story further, subscribe to watch the documents I plan to release and interviews I will conduct with scientists and community leaders. If this account has moved you, support policies that protect living cultures, not just human profit. Names matter in this record, so let me close with those who stood with me. Colonel Robert Hale, Dr. Elias Kim, Dr. Priya Desai, Professor Helen Carter, Agent Marcus Ruiz, Sarah Monroe, Michael Hargrove, Mayor Luis Ortega, Chief Anita Crow, and Loma, the matriarch of a clan that taught strangers how to be better humans. We kept a ledger of promises, and we tried to make good on them. The reserve still stands, and the observatory still watches. The classification that once sealed the files has been partially lifted, and fragments of our litigation remain redacted, but the core document, the treaty, reserve, the protocol for protection exists and has been used elsewhere as a model. This entire episode changed me in a way I couldn't have anticipated. I learned that kindness in bureaucracy requires work that is not glamorous, and that sometimes the most heroic thing you can do is refuse to escalate violence when violence would be expected. We are a species that can count the cost of choice, and sometimes we are lucky enough to pick the right ledger. The final thing I will say is simple, and it is a directive wrapped as a question. When the world offers you a creature that asks for sanctuary, do you decide to study or to protect? Our answer will determine not only whether some clans survive, but whether our own. Humanity looks back with shame or with dignity. If you want to see the primary documents, the memos, the signed protocols, and more of the recorded conversations, subscribe and stay with us. I will publish what I can, and I will keep pressing institutions to honor what they promised. The measure of a people is what it chooses to protect. Choose well.